On today's Time 100 Talks, we'll focus on how to rebuild and reset from the economic and social disruptions caused in part by the COVID-19 pandemic. Global leaders and decision makers will discuss their next steps for creating a world that's more resilient, economically sound, and sustainable. This episode is in partnership with the World Economic Forum and will feature founder, co-chairman, and co-chief investment officer of Bridgewater Associates, Ray Dalio, governor of Tokyo Yuriko Koike, and UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet. Today is Thursday, October 29th, 2020. This is Time 100 Talks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Time 100 Talks. I'm Edward Felsenthal, Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Time. Today's program is in partnership with the World Economic Forum. We'll explore opportunity in crisis. As nations around the world begin to rebuild from the pandemic, it's clear that we also have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reset our priorities. World Economic Forum Chairman Klaus Schwab has called this the Great Reset. How can we seize this moment of disruption to push for a world that is healthier, more resilient, sustainable, and just? What do all of us, individuals, businesses, governments, need to do to ensure that we don't simply revert to what came before? These questions and much more will be discussed on today's program. Before we get started, we'd like to thank Sompo Group for making today's important conversations possible. And here's a message from Sompo Group CEO, Kengo Sakurada.
Every business leader is talking about stakeholder capitalism. But what we are talking about is not the revival film at the second-run theaters. ESG criteria could be effective to screen stakeholders' needs for sustainable societies, companies, and capitalism. The SDGs are changing consumer behaviors. New value will create a new market. Concrete actions to collaborate with other stakeholders will contribute to the happiness of the whole society and to a better long-term business environment. Corporate value should be re-examined through the stream of profits in a long-term frame than the current capital market is doing, from the viewpoint of challenging risks that society must take. This should be enhanced through customer creation by embodying social value or common good of society. It is no longer a matter of charity or public relations. Of course, Japanese companies are no exception. Rather, we should or could have been more sensitive considering the Japanese business value system of Sompo Yoshi, or optimization of all parties concerned. With this in mind, Sompo has joined to undertake in the fields of insurance and elder care to cope with climate change, poverty, and aging society. We are at the dawn of the Great Reset, and there are many, many challenges surrounding us in every direction, but it's worthwhile for challenging. So let's move ahead for the future.
Thank you, Sakurada-san. We've got a lot to discuss today, so let's get started. Our first guest is the founder, co-chair, and co-chief investment officer of Bridgewater Associates, Ray Dalio. Ray will be joined by my colleague, Deputy Editor Sam Jacobs, and he'll speak on what he's learned as a business leader while steering his company through these unprecedented times.
I'm Time Deputy Editor Sam Jacobs, and I'm joined by Ray Dalio, Time 100 honoree and founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund. Ray, what's the single piece of advice you'd give to an investor today?
Don't think of. I'll give two. If you ask me for just one, I would say diversify. And when I mean diversify, I mean diversify your asset classes, diversify your currencies, and diversify your countries. I will add a second, and that is that realize that cash is the riskiest asset class, or one of the riskiest asset class, in an environment in which the government is printing a lot of cash and producing negative real returns for you. So you will get a negative real return of about 2% a year. Don't think of it as the safest asset class just because it doesn't move around a lot.
Let's talk about governments printing a lot of that cash, as you mentioned. It's one of the macroeconomic trends that you warn about today, this global increase in credit, central banks like the Federal Reserve printing a lot of money to keep our economy afloat. From your position, what's the long-term impact of that decision?
Well, first of all, it has to be done because when you get to the point that you have too much debt and you hit zero interest rates and you want to get money in the hands of people who need it most, the way that can happen, and it's happened throughout history, is that the government borrows a lot of money and this central bank doesn't want interest rates to go up and it prints a lot of money to give those checks out there. However, everything comes with a cost. And the cost is that the value of that money and the value of debt goes down. And as a result, you see it first in other assets. You see it in the appreciation of other storeholds of wealth, such as stocks and gold. And you see it in the depreciation of one currency in relationship to another. It's a very dangerous situation. So we have to be aware of that. Because it can threaten the position of the US dollar as a reserve currency. And the reason that's important is because when the US dollar is a reserve currency and people want to save in it, it allows us to borrow so much. But that's the problem too.
I want to talk a little bit about your company, Bridgewater Associates. It's known for its intense and distinct work culture. All of our offices and companies have been transformed by COVID-19. How has the coronavirus pandemic affected how you all work together?
Well, we're largely still remote. I would say maybe 80% remote. And we find remote to work very well. We were all set up for that because of different kinds of event risks. We could have a hurricane, power outages, and so on. And it's turned out to work very well. But we find that being together is a great thing too. But how we do that is, more planned. So there's times to get together, maybe a smaller percentage of the time when there's a project being worked on with social distancing, that kind of thing.
Your life may be the living example of the benefits of capitalism. You've benefited greatly from our system, but you also feel like there are problems with capitalism today. What's broken in our capitalist system?
Well, I think you start with the goal. Like, what do you want a system to do? I'll speak personally. I was born at a time and came in where there was a world of equal opportunity. My parents were lower middle class parents. My dad was a jazz musician. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I went to a public school. I got a good education. I came out to a world of equal opportunity. I could come up with ideas, and I did what I did. It's now unfair if you look at the outcomes. First, do we agree that that is the American dream and that's what we should provide something close to equal opportunity? Should the benefits be broad-based, and so on? I believe, like, when I look at the education system, particularly in poor areas and so on, it's a problem. I did a study of what the economic conditions were by quintiles, top 20%, next 20%, and so on. And I particularly studied the bottom 60%, which is the majority of the population. And I saw that in the top 40% of the population, they spent on average 5 times as much money on their children's education in the bottom 60%. It's not fair. It's not fair, and it narrows the population that you're drawing people from, so you're not going to tap the full talent pool. It's not productive, and history shows it's not sustainable. But I don't think that's any bad guys doing anything wrong. It's a system in which profit pursuit at itself is not going to accomplish all of its objectives. I mean, let's say, for example, you invent technologies that replace people. That is efficient for the system as a whole, but it does create a wider wealth gap. Or globalization is a great thing in terms of a global meritocracy and efficient production, but it does mean that jobs move in other places. And so it has to be restructured in a way where it achieves those other goals. Otherwise, it's not achieving broad-based opportunity. It's not fair, and history has shown it won't be sustainable. That's why when I combine it with the two other factors, in other words, I'm dealing with the debt factor, okay? When you combine these factors, when you are overly indebted and you're printing money and you're thinking that that's going to be sustainable, and you have a large wealth gap, and you have an economic downturn, you, throughout history, have conflict. You have civil wars. There are possibilities of different types of civil wars. So when you look at what's happening around us now, in terms of the types of conflict, what is the conflict mostly about? It's about money, mostly, all the other issues. And so that in and of itself undermines productivity. It's bad. So that capitalist system, which is very good in many ways, it brings out entrepreneurship, it allocates resources in many ways efficiently. It is not good enough and it needs to be reformed. And I'm worried that, by and large, capitalists know how to increase the size of the pie and come up with ideas and are adaptable and so on. But they don't know how to divide the pie well. And socialists don't know how to make the pie bigger as well. And so there needs to be a thoughtful, knowledgeable engineering of what is going to produce inclusive productivity.
I want to keep talking about this idea of a wealth gap. There's an expression that's increasingly popular among some on the left that every billionaire is a policy failure. Do you disagree?
I completely disagree.
Why?
Well, first of all, I don't like it because one of the problems of these phases is demonizing one group relative to another group. So in other words, let's say I was to say any policy, any group is a failure. I think that's not true. And but let's put it this way. Let's imagine we didn't have billionaires and think of all the things that wouldn't have been invented. Most people were successful billionaires. Most of them were self-made billionaires. They didn't even try to become billionaires. I didn't try to become a billionaire. I just liked the thing I did. You come up with a new idea, you implement the new idea, and if what you're offering is worth more than the cost of you producing, you make a profit and the thing grows. And so this is what scares me because it fuels productivity. If you're looking at what's happening in China in terms of the IPOs, for example, that they turn to capitalism and they make billionaires. I would say, I understand the complaint, okay? It's not the making of the billionaires. It's the making of the lack of equal opportunity. It's the making of those problems that I just spoke about. I mean, I think it would be great if everybody, Deng Xiaoping said, it's glorious to be rich. And what I mean is you want those opportunities to bring everybody up in a broad-based way. And I'm really worried about the demonization of any group.
Another trend that we're seeing in the rise of billionaires is a rise of billionaire philanthropy. And you're certainly someone who's given a lot to causes like health justice and public education. What do you say to someone who says, I think billionaires and individuals like Ray Dalio are having too big a role when it comes to these important public policy decisions, and that we need to restructure our society so that government, again, is leading on this as opposed to people like Bill Gates and Ray Dalio?
Well, first of all, I would say that the government and the population as a whole has to determine the rules. And there are benefits and drawbacks to having people be able to earn the amount of money they want and then to be able to direct it. In many cases, I think it's the private sector can do a good job, but the public sector needs to do a better job too. I think it's all a matter of the quality of the management. I would say though, I think the cycle through time has been a beautiful cycle. You know, it's not for me to say how that system works, just as long as it works well.
Are you hopeful?
The truth is I'm not very hopeful, only because it's easy to say that I'm hopeful. I wish I could say I'm hopeful. People would prefer me to say I'm hopeful. And I guess I'm hopeful over the long term, let's say maybe 15 years. I think the whole question is how we are with each other, whether we can work for a common dream, a common vision together, or whether we will continue to drift at being at each other's throats in a way that becomes increasingly threatening. What I'm seeing now is that I'm seeing a more win at all cost mentality, and I'm seeing a lack of respect for the common good, and as a result, even matters of who gets power and how they get power. So those things concern me because I did a study of history over the last 500 years. You could read it on LinkedIn to see how the reserve currency empires rose and declined. And what I saw is that when they got in financial trouble and there was more of a fighting over wealth, there was more emotion and there was more hatred and there was more win at all cost. And the type of fighting that they had with each other was, very bad, very disruptive. So I can rattle off the cases. And so I'm watching that progress. I don't want the fighting. I think that if you look at societies that have been successful, what they do is they find a way of agreeing what's the cause. So for example, if we could agree equal opportunity is an objective, and also making sure that the basics are well taken care of. In other words, first and foremost, equal education, something close to equal education, equal basic health care to make sure that those are taken care of, and that we can raise a population of civil people and goes out into opportunity, and that they are productive, we will have a good outcome. And if we can do that together in a way where we listen to each other and so on, I think that that is the only path to success. And I'm worried that we're not on that path.
Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, thank you very much for joining us on Time 100 Talks.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to Time 100 Talks. I'm Edward Felsenthal, Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Time. Today, we're speaking to decision makers and leaders on what the next steps are to create and rebuild a better world post-COVID-19. Our next guest, Yuriko Koike, the governor of Tokyo, will outline what she thinks some of those next steps are and how the pandemic has prompted her to rethink how Tokyo is run. She'll be joined by Charlie Campbell, Time's East Asia correspondent.
Hi, I'm Charlie Campbell, East Asia correspondent for Time. I'm delighted today to welcome Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike We'll be talking about Japan's pandemic response and opportunities to leverage the crisis to improve governance. Governor Koike, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. ありがとうございます。
Arigato. I understand that you'll be answering our questions in Japanese in order to be as precise as possible. So just to start off, how is the pandemic forcing you to rethink how Tokyo is run?
まずご承知のように、東京はですね、世界の中でも有数の都市で1400万人の人口があります。で、これまでにですね、死者の数は400人程度。今日の時点で重症者の方は東京において30人程度に抑えられています。基本的にはですね、この手洗いの徹底、それからこれは私のマスクですけれども、このマスクっていうのは日本の場合はですね、非常に以前から定着している。それからソーシャルディスタンスを取りましょうと。3つの密を避けましょうという話でですね、これまでもこれ見えますでしょうか、この3つの C を避けるということから、この closed spaces, crowded places, closed conversation、都民の皆さんに呼びかけて、かなりこのことについては浸透をしています。それからマスクの着用率でありますけれども、これはですね、すごく古い、これ、スペイン風邪が流行った頃のポスターなんですけれども、かなり着用する、いつも着用するというのがですね、2019年、昨年は 28%、昨年でも 28% あったんですが、今年はですね、なんとその3倍で 94% に伸びています。で、先ほどお見せしましたように、このスペイン風邪の時からですね、非常にマスクが日本では定着をしていて、ちょっと前まではマスクをするっていうのは、日本人か銀行強盗かというぐらい言われていましたけれども、今世界中でですね、このマスクがまずその効果についての論争が今も起こっていると、それが政治のシンボルにもなっているというようなことでありますけれども、日本ではすっかり定着をして、これかなり効果をもたらしているのではないかというふうに思います。それから公衆衛生の高さですけれども、このマスクなどもし、それから手洗いを徹底するということで、結果的にインフルエンザの発生件数ですけれども、去年に比べまして、今まだ季節ではないということもありますけれども、なんと1週間でたったの3人、昨年のですね、1000分の1以下に抑えられているということなんです。それからですね、子どもが感染しがちなですね、手足口病という病気があります。Hand, foot and mouth disease、と言われているもの。それから感染症胃腸炎、infectious gastroenteritis っていうんですか、この発生件数もですね、軒並み減少しているというのが、このところ、コロナへの関心がですね、逆に別の病気を抑えている。これは公衆衛生の高さは以前からありますし、これの効果が科学的な分析も必要ですけれども、靴を脱いで上がる、それからトイレが温水のウォシュレットになっているとかでですね、いろいろとこれまでの日本の公衆衛生の意識の高さと実行、これは大変大きいのではないか。また人同士が、法律よりも人のまたは社会でそれを大きく支えているということだと思います。最も社会的経済的に都民の生活は大きく落ち込んで、影響を受けています。例えば GDP ですけれども戦後最大の落ち込みを記録をしている。それから今後はですね、そういう中で、失業の問題なども出てきます。廃業の問題も出てきています。ですから感染の拡大防止の徹底、そして社会経済活動の推進を両立させるということ、そのために新しい日常をしっかりと確立しようというところです。そして今東京におきましてはですね、このようにこのようにですね、虹のステッカ これをですね、感染防止徹底宣言ステッカーということを、だいたい今、27万件近いお店でこれを貼っていただいています。安心してできる、利用できる施設だというサインになっています。それから店舗の名前、住所などはマップとしてオンラインでも公開しておりますので、レストラン、劇場、美術館、商店街、スポーツジムなど、このお店、これを貼ってあるお店は安心して入ってください。で、お店の方ももちろん、この感染防止対策を徹底していますということを宣言、ステートメントとしてやっていると。でこれは一種の行動経済学ではないかということを考えています。参照点として、リファレンスポイントとしてこのステッカーがあることによってですね、利用者にとってもお店側にとってもそれを参考にしながらさまざまな消費活動を行うという点であります。それからその他、下水の中のウイルス量の分析も行っていまして、これを感染の拡大の予兆にするという研究も現在行われております。日本水環境学会と連携して進めているところです。それからアプリでありますけれども、コロナ見守りサービス、ロボットなども活用しまして、これロボットですね。このロボットはですね、感染した方がホテルなどで、しばらくそちらに滞在していただくときに、職員と感染した陽性者の方との接点、非接触、タッチレスのそれをサポートしてくれる役目をしております。サステナブルリカバリーということが今大きな課題であります。気候変動だけではありません。このサステナブルリカバリーをぜひとも進めていきたい。また単にそれはコロナ以前の社会に戻るのではなくて、そして多様性にあふれた人が輝く東京の実現を目標にして、都民に呼びかけています。またちょっと歴史を紐解きますと、第7代の後藤新平という大丈夫ですか？はい。後藤新平という方が東京市の市長を務めていた時代があるんですね。これは1894年の頃、日本では日清戦争が起こった時に、このコレラが蔓延する中国から日本の兵士が帰還するという、その時にですね、世界でも前例のない大規模な検疫所を瀬戸内海の島にいっぱい作って20万人の兵士をそこで、この隔離をしたと。それによって国内でのこれらの蔓延を防いだ。単に科学、テクノロジー、新しいものからだけでなくて、歴史から学ぶということも必要だと考えています。1400万人の命を預かるという意味で、いろんな今、試行錯誤をしているところです。
You mentioned that Tokyo is very big. Not many people realize that the Tokyo metropolitan area that you administer includes not just the city itself, but an urban sprawl of some 38 million people. It's very much like running a small but extremely developed country. How are you reassessing infrastructure needs following the pandemic? Things like public transport and remote working.
東京1400万人の人口、そして人の流れは大変大きいものがあります。公共交通も大変発達をしていると。そういう中で、これまで都においてはですね、また日本全体で、いわゆるテレワークっていう、テレワーキングっていうのは、あまり発達していなかった。このコロナの問題が生じてから、この東京都は、これまでも取り組んでいましたけれども、一層テレワーキングの導入を推進しています。例えば昨年度、このテレワーキングは 25% にとどまっていたんですけれども、今年の6月には一気にそれが跳ね上がって 60% にまで達成を しています。そしてまたこれからも伸ばしていく、そのために東京都として様々な補助もしています。これによって通勤混雑、大変有名な東京の通勤混雑ですが、これも緩和をされています。またテレワークというのは働き方も変えていきます。日本の朝から晩まで働いているというワーカホリック日本人の働き方も大きくこのコロナによって、変えざるを得なくなっているというのは、新しい働き方一歩進んだという一つのインセンティブと言いましょうかね、一つのきっかけになったと、モメンタムをもたらしたと思います。で、新しい日常の下で、歩いて通ったり、自転車の利用なども進んでいます。この機会にですね、車中心の街から人中心の街へと変えていく、こちらもいいチャンスだと思いますし、またそれと再開発、都市の再開発を合わせていく、ウォーカブルな街づくり。かつて、ニューヨークのですね、交通を大きく変えた、サディック・カーンさん、街を変えたサディック・カーンさんという方はニューヨーク市で活躍された方ですけど、その彼女と連携しながら街づくりも変えてまいりました。少しずつですけれども、東京は世界の大都市と比べて、自転車の利用度も低い、そしてオフィス開発と合わせて、この自転車をもっと活用できるように駐輪スペースも整備をしてまいりましたけれども、このコロナ禍で自転車シェアリングの普及、そしてまたこれも数字で申し上げますとですね、自転車シェアリングの登録者数は今年の3月と4月と比べますと4割増加をいたしました。このインフラストラクチャー、街づくりと公共交通、そして個人の交通手段など、このコロナによって大きく東京も変わっております。
The last time we met was in your office about a year ago while Tokyo was hosting the hugely successful Rugby World Cup, and there was this amazing buzz about the city, about the upcoming Olympics, which have now had to be postponed. Given the huge investment spent on the Games, how important is making the rescheduled 2021 event a success?
もちろん大変重要です。そしてまたコロナで、皆さんの気持ちが世界中の気持ちがですね、とても不安になっている中で、9月に、先月ですね、全米オープンテニスが開かれましたよね。で、日本にとっては嬉しいことに2年連続で、TIME100 に、選ばれました TIME100 に、選出された大坂なおみ選手ら、あと車椅子テニスもそうなんですけど、日本人の選手が大変活躍して3人が優勝ということを女性のシングル、女子シングル、男性の車椅子、ダブルスなどで日本人選手が大変活躍しました。と同時に世界中の人がですね、全米オープンには大変湧いたわけです。先日も全仏オープンが行われましたよね。これらやはりスポーツのもたらす力っていうのは極めて、大きい、ということが言えると思います。そして東京でのオリンピック大会の開催ですけれども、例えば選手などへの定期的な PCR の検査、そしてまた安全安心な運営のためにどのような対策が必要なのか、どのような工夫が必要なのかということ、これ国組織委員会、そして IF、もちろん東京都、これ一丸となって今その対策をどのような形にしていくかということで会議を重ねているところです。いずれにしましてもコロナ禍において改めてスポーツの力というのが大変高いということを示したわけです。で、東京2020大会、人類が一丸となってこの新型コロナウイルスに打ち勝つ、そのボンド、絆をさらに強める、その象徴となるためにもですね、極めて意義の高い大会であります。そしてまた準備を進めるためにもですね、都民国民の皆さんや世界中の方々からも共感が得られる大会であることが必要です。そして費用も1年延びることによってかかってきているわけですけれども、そのためには大会の費用の 大会そのものの簡素化をするということで、IOC 組織委員会と、先ほど申し上げたように協議を行っている。で、サービス水準の最適化、合理化、それから延期によって生じておりますコストをいかにして削減をするかなどがテーマになっています。で、先月 IOC の調査委員会が開かれまして、そこで52にもわたる見直し項目が合意されました。で、その概算の数値が先週報告をされたところであります。まだまだ工夫すべきところはたくさんあります。で、引き続きすべての関係者の皆さんと大会の簡素化に向けて努力を重ねる。そして経費の削減だけでなくて、オリンピック・パラリンピックの新たなモデルを示すことにつながると考えています。
The Games will be an additional draw for Japan's already booming tourism industry, which is becoming extremely important to the economy of both Tokyo and the nation as a whole. Will there be any substantive changes to how the 2021 Games are run and tourism more broadly in order to safeguard public health?
大会を成功へと導く、そのためにはですね、選手の皆さん、アスリートの皆さん、そして観客ですね、スペクテーターズ、そして関係者、すべての方にとって安全安心な環境を提供できる、その準備を進めるのは極めて重要です。大会でのコロナ対策とすれば、例えば空港を迎え入れる水際対策をどうするのか、感染防止対策をどうするのか、医療体制の確保をどうするのか、これらの重要な課題があります。こちらも国、組織委員会等など関係者で総合的なコロナ対策の検討を行って、年内をめどにしてこの中間整理を行ってまいります。また、ポストコロナにフィットする最適な大会の実現に向けたさまざまな取り組みというのは、ある意味東京モデルとして次の開催都市パリだったり、すぐ直近は北京ですね、その後がパリ、また夏の大会はその後ロサンゼルスと引き継がれることになります。で、今後とも関係者の皆さんとの協力が必要です。で、安全安心な大会の実現に向けて、このいい東京モデルを作っていきたいと考えております。例えば、あと、そうですね、選手村のどういう運営をするのか、食事はどうするのかなど、本当に一つ一つの課題ありますけれども、みんなでそれをテーブルに乗せて、今、協議を行っているところです。
Across the world, the pandemic is highlighting difficulties coordinating between local and national governments. Now, of course, following the resignation of Shinzo Abe, Japan has a new Prime Minister, Mr. Yoshihide Suga. How important is the partnership between the Tokyo and national government, especially at times of crisis, and how can that be strengthened?
安倍総理とも連携を取ってまいりましたし、先月、新しく総理になられたシュガーじゃないですよ、菅ですよ、菅総理大臣と初めて、この件でも総理大臣として初めてお会いしました。また新型コロナウイルス対策、東京2020大会、これはどちらも国との連携が必要だ。そのことを、菅大臣、総理大臣と私との間でも確認をいたしました。で、また東京というのは世界から人が集まって、そして我が国の経済活動の中心を担っている、重要な都市であります。そこが国と連携をするというのは非常に有効でありまして、重要な要素になります。一方でですね、自治体ですから、地域の実情に応じた実効性の高い取り組みを進めていくのが自治体の責任でもあります。国にはこれから自治体の取り組みに対しての支援をお願いすることはこれからも以前もそうでしたし、これからもそうであります。新たな内閣とも連携しながら引き続き幅広く対策を進めていきたいと考えています。またこれからもですね、この世界が激動する中で、私は今回のコロナ対策についても 東京をはじめ日本全体、都民国民のですね非常に高い公衆衛生の意識であるとか、認識をもとに、進めてきているわけであります。そしてまた今後の経済をどのような方向性に引っ張っていくのか、今さまざまな国、世界全体の貿易なども大きな変化を見せております。そういう中で東京が強みを発揮する、また金融などにおいてもその中心、アジアの中心としても進めていくように、国と連携しながら進めていきたいと考えています。
When we last spoke, you talked a lot about your campaign in offices to have people not wear their jackets and ties to reduce air conditioning. I was wondering whether we might talk a little bit about that.
今、気候変動の問題はコロナとですね、まず多くの方々の意識はコロナ対策になっています。一方でこの気候変動っていうのは世界中で大きな自然災害ももたらしています。コロナの対策も気候変動も結局私たちのライフスタイルがですね大きく影響しているわけです。一人一人の行いは小さいかもしれません。一人一人のマスクをするしないっていうのは小さなことかもしれません。ただそのことが世界中で70億人もの人たちがまた一つ、例えば東京で1400万人の子どもさんから大人まで、それぞれ気をつけていく、そういう意識を持っていく、技術を高める、そして制度を作る。これは私は柔道や空手のコンセプト、フィロソフィーである心、技、体と呼んでいますけれども、心はマインドですね。技はテクノロジーですね。スキルでもいいです。そして体というのはボディでありますけれども、と訳しますけれども、システムであります。この心、技、体が揃うとですね、対策がうまく進んでいくということが、クールビズという気候変動に対してあなたができることをやりましょうという運動を進めました。それによってですね、日本の国民の大きなこの意識が変革をしたという実例があります。改めてこのコロナ禍でも気候変動の重要性ということを説いていきたいと思っていますし、都民の皆さんにもこのコロナ禍における気候変動対策、結果として自転車が進む、テレワークが進むというのはある意味 CO2 の削減などに大きな寄与をしていると思います。で、これらのことを両方考えていく、感染拡大と経済活動を両立させることと、コロナ対策と気候変動対策、ある意味通じる共通項があるのではないでしょうか。都民に分かりやすくメッセージを伝えて、そして心、技、体で進めたいと思います。
Governor Koike, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.
ありがとうございました。I really enjoyed your questions.
And welcome back to Time 100 Talks. We hope you're enjoying and learning from today's program, focusing on how we rebuild from the pain and hardship of 2020 and reset for a better future. Our last guest in today's program is the former president of Chile and current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. She'll be joined by Time's international editor, Dan Stewart, and she'll discuss what actions major corporations can take to advance the cause of human rights.
Hi, I'm Time's international editor, Dan Stewart, and I'm joined today by Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile and the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you for talking with us today. High Commissioner, it must have been a very busy and quite difficult year for you. I think Washington think tank Freedom House lists 80 countries around the world where democratic and human rights have declined since COVID-19 arrived. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it depends on if you're talking of human rights on the political and civil rights, for example. It happens that many countries introduce a lot of measures that are accepted internationally according to the international human rights law, like limiting mobility or the freedom of assembly because of the need to diminish the spread of the virus. But in some countries, they have gone a little bit further what is accepted, and they have been, because all these measures, you can make exceptional measures, they have to be limited to a certain time, they have to be proportionate to the need, and so on. But what it could never be cut is, or put limit, is to the freedom of press, or the freedom of expression, for example. And so in some countries, they have made it too tough, and they have gone into laws that limit the freedom of expression. Journalists have been harassed or in jail, accused of fake news, et cetera, et cetera. So there are, on the other hand, if you think on a pandemic that nobody was prepared for, even the most powerful countries, you have seen a diminishing of human rights in terms of social and economic rights and cultural rights in some places. So it is, some are intended and some are unintended, if I may say. But of course, we have been speaking out against all these measures that have no explanation linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. And some countries have used it to increase their own power and to diminish the power of the people. And the third part is that one of the main issues in a response to a pandemic or to any health issues is that people need to have information, correct information, and needs to be able to also be able to participate, because the situation of one people and others are different. And participation is something we haven't seen almost in non-countries. I mean, very few people have been able to participate in the response directly in their communities, for example, or to be heard by the authorities. So I think this is something that is linked to we have seen a little bit increase of authoritarianism, if I may say, during the last years, and now with COVID-19 as well.
Well, this is something I was going to say. It was a trend, of course, that existed before the pandemic, right? That impunity in certain countries has gone up. I mean, do you think is it okay to blame that, do you think, on an absence of global leadership? A lot of people have.
Well, I think it's a mix, because I do believe that there has been a lack of leadership, but there has been negative leadership as well. I mean, what I mean is leaders need. Some leaders in many countries have denied the existence of the pandemic. They have diminished the risk of the pandemic in their speeches, and then they are sending wrong messages. But also, I think that multilateralism has been under attack for some time. And I think this is so wrong always, I think it's so wrong. But in particular, when you're thinking of a pandemic, that is something global, it's a global challenge, and no one is going to be safe by himself. We all need to be able to cooperate globally, to coordinate actions, because it's a pandemic. And this will be very important in the discussion in the future of the vaccine, for example. If you have vaccine nationalism and everyone wants to maintain the vaccine for themselves and not have access to everyone else, nobody will be safe from the pandemics, and we will be seeing it as a health crisis, but also on the other consequences as well.
Are you confident that when their vaccine does come, that the major global countries will come together, perhaps under the aegis of the World Health Organization, to make sure that the vaccine is distributed fairly and nationally?
I mean, we have been calling for that. We have been calling that the vaccine, once it's produced, a safe vaccine that produces immunity and so on, should be considered a global public good, because we need, I mean, of course, it won't be possible to do it immediately, probably, because the capacity of production might not be so high. But if I may say in some way, we will need the 7 billion people in the world to be really immune if we really want to stop the virus. So I hope that this will be heard and will be understood, that it's not, I mean, it's good for everyone if everyone's safe. So in the meantime, the UN, us, WHO has been making the same calls, and I will say in the scientific community, I think there's a lot of agreement on this. Probably the biggest problem will be in terms of markets and in terms of political decisions as well.
Well, that leads me to a question. I mean, you said that multilateralism is often the thing that people point to, but of course, other stakeholders bear responsibility in this too. I mean, what do you feel, for example, for the cause of human rights, what responsibilities do major corporations have? For example, in distribution of vaccines, like you were just saying.
Well, I think, I mean, I think they should get responsibility on this, and we have been discussing. We have been in a lot of webinars with business and human rights. We have this forum on business and human rights, and where a lot of people from big corporations participate. And I have been making this call, and many corporations do understand. I mean, not necessarily I've been in meetings with corporations who produce vaccines. I'm just making the advocacy to all of them to say that this is a responsibility of all of us, not only of states or WHO. I'm sure that everybody will agree on who has to receive it first, and these are the frontliners, of course, not all people who are essential, health and other essential services. But the aim and the goal should be that it could be accessible and affordable for everyone.
I'd like to take us to the theme of the issue that we just published in Time this week is in partnership with the World Economic Forum on what we call the Great Reset. This idea that to turn a crisis like the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity. Do you think this is a moment for a new compact on preserving human rights and civil liberties along the lines of what happened after World War II?
Well, I was hoping that. I was hoping that this pandemic will make people realize the importance, first of all, of, if I would say, global collectiveness. I mean, we're all part of the humanity, and we all need to respect our rights. And I was expecting, because for some time, the same time that multilateralism has been under attack, human rights concepts have been under attack as well. And it has been very difficult to include in many last year or 2 years ago in declarations the concept of human rights and so on. And I was hoping that this could be like a revival, if I may say, in terms of how important human rights are. Because of us being human beings, that's why we deserve all those human rights. That's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights establishes. I think the framework of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is still okay. You don't need to make big changes because, for example, if you think on digital revolution, what has been defined is that what is offline is also online. I mean, the same kind of values. But of course, we will need to improve certain frameworks and certain legal instruments, for example, on all what is in artificial intelligence and so on, because all of that can be fantastic for humankind, but it can also pose a threat, because it can be used against people. So I think it's a good opportunity, but I think it has to be an opportunity also to consider that we cannot go back to normality as the day before this started, because that showed a world that was completely full of inequalities. Because what COVID-19 has laid bare is the profound inequalities, the lack of investing in health for a long time, the problems with education, the lack of for example, access to online in many parts of the world, and so on. And COVID-19 has aggravated and exacerbated those inequalities. So we should aim to go to a world where we have, I would say, real sustainable development in terms of a more inclusive economy, in terms also a fairer and greener development, with cleaner ways of energy, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing that we need to consider seriously is to respect the nature and the biodiversity, because many of these, all the last epidemics and pandemics, Ebola, SARS, MERS, and of course now COVID-19, are zoonoses. I mean, wild animals who either contaminate domestic animals or are eaten by human beings, and that's how many of these viruses spread. So we need to take really seriously nature and biodiversity. And we have now an opportunity, because this will be a discussion on the 2020 framework of biodiversity. So I hope that this opportunity is not lost, that we really use it to push forward on human rights, on respect for nature, on biodiversity, etc., and an inclusive economy, and to be able to push forward as well on the Agenda 2030. That means Agenda for Sustainable Development, that will take people out of poverty, of inequality, and could have better opportunities in life.
Well, I mean, that's a great range of challenges which you describe. I mean, probably the keenest, though, that we see is the abuses of human rights, to go back to the original question. I guess from the US perspective, which is, when the US sees those kinds of abuses happening, do you think it is enough to incentivize good behavior, or should a country like the US that has a great economic authority and influence, should they be doing more to isolate or to punish that where they see it?
Oh, you mean the US attitude towards people who violate human rights?
Yes.
Well, I think they could do more. I think the US could be more, how could I say, more even, if I may say, in the analysis of human rights violations, because sometimes you know that there are countries where there are violations of human rights, but nobody says anything. So I think it will be important that the US continue engaged with human rights. They decided to withdraw, from the Human Rights Council, and of course they remain engaged with the issue, with the theme, but from outside the Human Rights Council. But I think they should do more.
The State Department launched its own commission on unalienable rights recently. Is that something that you applaud?
Well, I haven't seen the results of the commission, but I think that one important thing on human rights is that we have an international agreed framework of human rights. The Universal Declaration, there's a lot of human rights UN system. So I think we have the framework enough, the system in place that can work. So I'm not sure what that commission will bring, but I'm not sure the reasons either for that conformation of that commission. So I will not make any prejudice, because I'm against prejudices. But of course, I think we do have in the international order enough material, enough consensus, and enough agreement. And the important thing is that everybody agrees, because the difference with other organizations is that when you are a member of a treaty body, for example, it binds you legally. It's not just you want to, no, you're obliged to really fulfill all what you are supposed to do. So I think that's an important thing. The system that we have in the UN, it can be improved. Now it's the reform of the treaty bodies that have been done by member states, but we have a good system. As always, everything can get better.
At a human level, I mean, it must be a challenge for you. This is something that you've experienced personally under Pinochet's regime, being detained, being tortured. How do you stay hopeful at a moment like this, when the pandemic gives cover to authoritarian regimes that are wanting to do this kind of behavior?
Well, but maybe I will have to remember what Desmond Tutu used to say. He uses a word I forgot, but like a prisoner of hope, if I may say. He uses another word, but means that I cannot give up. I have to continue thinking, but I have to tell you, because you were mentioning before, that I have learned in life that it's people who make decisions, political decisions, in one direction or another, it's not just because it's the right thing to do. Usually in politics, that is not very common, if I may say. So I learned that when I was at UN Women, that every time I spoke about women's rights, sometimes nobody was listening. So I understood that I had to develop a narrative where I showed that It's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. And I think that's one thing that maybe we can always do better, to try to communicate why something that is the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do.
It's interesting you bring up that you were the executive director of UN Women, because that's another thing that research has found during this pandemic, that gender inequality might be widened dramatically. How much of a concern is that for you?
Well, a big concern, because what we have seen is that even though the virus does not discriminate, I mean, everyone can have it, but it does impact disproportionately certain groups. Not because they are, I would say, not because they are more fragile, it's because of discrimination and inequalities for a long time. And we have seen that in older people, in women and girls, in people from the indigenous communities, people from LGBTI communities, people living with disabilities, of course, more rural and poor people. Those are the most disproportionately impacted, and minorities. And as you see in the US, for example, the numbers of people from Afro-American or Latinos who have died are bigger than the proportion in the population. So we do know, and in the case of women, this has meant, first of all, women usually work on areas, more informal areas, and many of those areas who had been really cut by the lockdown, for example, hotels, restaurants, touristic activities. Secondly, we have seen a dramatic increase of domestic violence, gender-based violence, because of the lockdown. And so many countries had started to develop a lot of different campaigns, and in many places as well, because all these shelters who protect victims of violence were closed because they were not considered essential services. So in some places they did, like Spain, Portugal, they remain as essential services. So women who had a situation could go and ask for help. And also, as I said, because in terms of the social consequences, because many times women have to take care of the older and so on. But on the other hand, if you consider women in general, it might change from one case to another. But imagine that you have a woman who's an old woman, who's living with disability, or in a rural area, or indigenous. I mean, you also will have the intersection of all these factors that will make them much more vulnerable.
Well, I think that's about all that we have time for today. Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for taking the time to talk to us at TIME100 Talks.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Dan and Michelle, and thanks to all of our contributors and guests, and to all of you for being with us today. I also want to thank Sompo Group and its CEO, Kengo Sakurada, for making today's program and these important conversations possible. For more information on Time100 Talks, past, present, and future, just go to time.com/Time100 Talks. We'll be back soon with another program and hope you'll join us then. Thanks for watching.